The air on this humid May afternoon in 2004 hangs heavy, thick with the smell of recent rain on damp Appalachian earth and the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke. Deep in the backcountry of Raleigh County, West Virginia, sunlight struggles to penetrate the dense, oppressive canopy of oak and hickory trees, casting the narrow dirt path in a perpetual twilight. The only sound breaking the near-total silence is the rhythmic, unsettling thump of a worn tire on a Ford Ranger pickup hitting deep, muddy ruts in the road, a sound that feels more like a labored heartbeat than transportation. At the wheel, photographer Mark Lyda grips the worn plastic, his knuckles white. He's been driving for nearly an hour since leaving the last paved road, guided only by the vague directions of a local sheriff who had warned him, "Some folks out here, they ain't looking for company." A crude, hand-lettered sign nailed to a tree appears suddenly, "Private property, beware of DOG." As the truck rounds a final, sharp bend, the woods abruptly give way to a small, grim clearing. An unpainted, dilapidated shack materializes from the trees, its wood weathered to a skeletal gray, looking as ancient as the hills surrounding it. On the porch, a figure sits motionless in a rusted metal chair. As Lyda's truck slows to a crawl, the figure turns its head. It's a man, gaunt and thin, whose eyes are unsettlingly misaligned, one staring directly forward while the other drifts lazily toward the tree line. He doesn't speak or wave, he just watches the approaching vehicle with a profound, unnerving stillness. Then, from the deep shadows of the porch, a second man scrambles forward on all fours. A guttural, violent bark erupts from him, a sound that is shockingly, primally human, not canine. He continues barking, a frantic, territorial display of pure, raw instinct, his movements jerky and unpredictable. Lyda cuts the engine. The sudden, deafening silence is immediately shattered by the man's continued, frantic barks echoing off the trees. The sound is raw, visceral, and utterly disorienting. From inside the shack, a screen door groans open with a long, painful creak, its springs stretched and useless. The interior is a black void, revealing nothing of who or what might be emerging. In the remote, isolated hollows of southern West Virginia, some families are not just forgotten by the modern world. They are trapped in a reality shaped by secrets as old and deep-rooted as the mountains themselves. This is the story of what happens when that world is pierced, and a hidden tragedy is exposed to the harsh light of the 21st century, forcing us to ask a difficult question. Where is the line between documentation and exploitation? For years, the memory of that clearing in the woods haunted Mark Lyda. The image of the man scrambling on all fours, the guttural barks, the silent, misaligned gaze of the other, it was an encounter that etched itself into his professional and personal conscience. By 2008, Lyda had conceived of a new project, a series of portraits he called Soft White Underbelly, intended to provide a voice and a face to the unseen, the marginalized, and the forgotten fringes of American society. The Whitakers were the genesis of this idea, the most extreme example of lives lived beyond the pale of modern understanding. He knew he had to go back, but this time not just as a photographer passing through. He needed to understand. His first stop wasn't the dirt road, but the Raleigh County Sheriff's Department in Beckley, a pragmatic step to announce his intentions and ensure he wasn't crossing a line that would land him in trouble. He was met with a potent mix of professional courtesy and deep-seated Appalachian skepticism. Deputy Caleb Thorne, a man whose family had been in Raleigh County since the coal boom, listened patiently to Lyda's pitch. Thorne leaned back in his creaking office chair, his expression unreadable. "Look," he began, his voice a low drawl, "what you're talking about isn't a crime scene. It's a tragedy, sure, but it ain't illegal." He explained that West Virginia Code Section 482301 permitted first-cousin marriage, a fact that often shocked outsiders. Social services has been up that hollow before, years ago. You can't force help on folks who don't want it, can't understand it, and have a legal right to be left alone. They're not prisoners. They're just there. You go up there with that camera, you're not a reporter. To them, and to their neighbors, you're a, come here, looking to put their misery on display. You need to be damn sure you know what you're starting. Thorne's warning hung in the air, a stark framing of the ethical tightrope Lyda was about to walk. The deputy offered no official escort, only a grim nod of understanding. The drive back into the mountains felt different this time. The oppressive canopy of trees seemed to press in closer, the shadows deeper. Every rut in the road felt like a deliberate obstacle, a physical manifestation of the community's resistance to intrusion. This wasn't an exploratory trip anymore. It was a conscious decision to breach a sanctuary of suffering, armed with the controversial justification of awareness. The hand-lettered, "Private Property" sign seemed to scream its message with more ferocity. Thorne's words echoed in his mind. "You need to be damn sure you know what you're starting." Was this documentation, or was it the beginning of an exploitation, the very thing the deputy had cautioned against? The question had no easy answer. As the Ford Ranger rolled into the clearing, the scene was hauntingly familiar. Laureen sat on the porch, a silent, still figure. Timmy was nearby, his head cocked as if listening to something only he could hear. And then, the explosion of sound. Ray, bursting from the shadows, his barks frantic, territorial, and painfully human. Lyda cut the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the raw intensity of the display. But this time, someone else emerged from the dark doorway of the shack. It was an older woman, her face etched with a lifetime of hardship but her eyes sharp and lucid. This was Betty Whitaker. She didn't shout or threaten. She simply walked to the edge of the porch, placed a calming hand on Ray's shoulder, and fixed Lyda with a steady, penetrating gaze. It was a look that carried the weight of a question. "What do you want with us?" The initial incident wasn't a clash of laws, but a confrontation of worlds, right here on this rotting porch. Betty's gaze held no malice, only a profound weariness, as if she had been waiting for this question her entire life. She gestured for Lyda to sit on an overturned bucket near the porch steps, a silent invitation into her world. Ray had quieted, now pacing restlessly behind her, his attention shifting between the stranger and the tree line. "My daddy and my uncle, they married my mama and my aunt," she stated, her voice raspy but clear, cutting through the humid air. "Brothers married sisters." The words landed with the simple weight of fact, not shame. She was explaining the weather, not confessing a secret. Lyda listened, his camera resting forgotten on the ground beside him. He was no longer a photographer documenting a subject, he was a witness receiving a testimony. The puzzle of the Whitaker family wasn't a mystery to be solved, but a history to be heard, right here on this porch, from the one person left who could piece it all together. The implications of Betty's statement were staggering, a genetic bottleneck created by a single generation. While first-cousin marriage carries known risks, the union of two brothers with two sisters, creating double first cousins, is a far rarer and more potent scenario. According to studies published by the National Institutes of Health, children of first cousins face a 1.7 to 2.8% increased risk of significant congenital defects. However, the offspring of double first cousins inherit a much higher degree of homozygosity, meaning they are vastly more likely to receive identical copies of recessive genes from both parents. This exponentially increases the chances for rare genetic disorders, cognitive impairments, and physical deformities to manifest. The Whitaker siblings were not just a statistical anomaly, they were the living embodiment of a genetic perfect storm, a tragedy written into their DNA a generation before they were even born. The science provided a cold, hard framework for the suffering Lyda was witnessing. An inquiry into Raleigh County public records confirmed the stark reality of Betty's account. Marriage licenses stored in the county courthouse, their ink faded on brittle, yellowed paper, showed the union of John and Henry Whitaker to Mary and Ida Perkins in the mid-1930s. Subsequent birth certificates for their children, including Laureen, Betty, and Ray, listed the parents as required, creating an official, bureaucratic paper trail of the family's insular lineage. A search through state databases revealed no criminal charges related to the family's situation, reinforcing what Deputy Thorne had explained. West Virginia Code Section 482301 provided a legal shield. Furthermore, a review of social services records, obtained through a formal information request, showed a handful of wellness checks dating back to the 1990s. The reports were brief and conclusive. The family was isolated and intellectually disabled but showed no signs of abuse or neglect by their own standards. They were deemed capable of living independently, and legally, the state's hands were tied. The family's extreme isolation was not purely a matter of choice or culture, it was deeply rooted in the economic despair of the region. U.S. Census Bureau data from the early 2000s paints a grim picture of Raleigh County, a place left behind by the collapse of the coal industry. At the time of Lyda's first visit, the county's poverty rate hovered near 20%, significantly higher than the national average. Median household income was barely half of what families earned in more prosperous parts of the country. For generations, the coal mines had provided a path, however difficult, to a life beyond the hollows. When those mines closed, the paths vanished. The Whitakers were trapped not only by their genetics but by a geography of economic abandonment. With no jobs, limited education, and a culture of deep self-reliance, the incentive and the means to leave, to marry outside their immediate community, had evaporated long ago. Armed with Betty's testimony, the stark scientific facts, and the official records that corroborated the story, Mark Lyda returned to his motel room in Beckley. The footage he had captured was raw and powerful. He had the barks, the vacant stares, the quiet dignity of Laureen, and the weary resilience of Betty. He also had the full weight of Deputy Thorne's warning echoing in his mind. You need to be damn sure you know what you're starting. The ethical tightrope was now stretched taut before him. Releasing this story to the world through his soft white underbelly project could bring awareness and, potentially, desperately needed help. But it would also inevitably transform the Whitakers from forgotten figures in a remote hollow into subjects of global spectacle. It was a violation of their privacy to save them from their circumstances. He sat in the dim, sterile light of the room, the camera on the table feeling less like a tool and more like a weapon, and began to edit. The video, titled simply, Inbred Family, The Whitakers, went live on YouTube in 2020. The initial upload was not accompanied by fanfare or a marketing push. It was simply another entry in the soft white underbelly catalog. But the internet's algorithm, an entity as inscrutable as the hollows of West Virginia, seized upon it. Within days, the view count exploded. First tens of thousands, then hundreds, then millions. The comment section became a digital town square of raw, unfiltered human reaction. There was an avalanche of pity, disgust, and armchair genetic analysis. For every comment expressing genuine compassion, there were 10 filled with cruel jokes or morbid fascination. The Whitakers, who had lived their entire lives in analog obscurity, were now global curiosities, their most vulnerable moments endlessly replayed, dissected, and shared across continents. The isolation that had defined their existence for generations was shattered by a million clicks. The digital flood soon breached its banks and spilled into the physical world. The once impenetrable seclusion of the Whitaker homestead was compromised. The trickle of curious locals Lyda might have anticipated became a steady stream of cars with out-of-state license plates, navigating the treacherous dirt road not with purpose, but with a sense of entitled tourism. People, emboldened by the perceived lawlessness of the backcountry, began trespassing, walking onto the property with phones held high, hoping to capture their own viral moment. The family's fragile peace was shattered by the crunch of unfamiliar tires and the sight of strangers peering through the trees. Ray's frantic, protective barks were no longer directed at a single, cautious photographer, but at a rotating cast of intruders who saw the family not as human beings deserving of privacy, but as a roadside attraction. The very sanctuary of their home had become the destination for a dark pilgrimage. This horrifying consequence forced Mark Lyda into a role he had never intended: gatekeeper. The documentarian became a protector. He saw the monster he had, in his view, unintentionally created and felt a profound responsibility to contain it. He posted urgent follow-up videos and community updates, his tone shifting from that of a detached observer to a desperate guardian. He pleaded with his millions of new viewers, please, do not go looking for the Whitakers. Do not visit their home. You are endangering them. He explained that their fame, while bringing awareness, had also put a target on their backs. The first great obstacle to helping the family was not a government agency or a legal barrier. It was the uncontrollable, ravenous curiosity of the very audience he had sought to educate. He had opened a door to their world, and now he was desperately trying to slam it shut before they were trampled. The GoFundMe campaign, established by Lyda as a direct response to the flood of public concern, became the new focal point of the Whitaker saga. It was an act of crisis management, an attempt to channel the chaotic energy of the internet into something constructive. The initial goal was a modest sum, perhaps enough to patch the roof or ensure a steady supply of food. But the campaign's trajectory mirrored the video's viral ascent. The total climbed at a dizzying pace, quickly surpassing $10,000, then $20,000, and eventually cresting over $50,000. Each dollar was a vote of compassion, but it was also a logistical and ethical landmine. How do you administer a five-figure sum to a family that lives almost entirely outside the cash economy? A family for whom a $20 bill might as well be a foreign artifact. Lyda, from his studio in California, was now the unwilling financial custodian for a life he had only intended to document. The practicalities of managing the funds from across the country proved impossible. Lyda needed a trusted local partner, someone on the ground who understood the delicate social fabric of Raleigh County. He made a call to the one person who had warned him from the start, Deputy Caleb Thorne. The conversation was brief and to the point. Lyda explained the situation, the money, the trespassers, the overwhelming need for a local administrator. Thorne was silent for a long moment, the sound of the precinct office buzzing faintly in the background. "You sure opened a can of worms, didn't you?" he finally said, his voice devoid of accusation, filled only with a weary resignation. Reluctantly, Thorne agreed to help oversee the distribution of funds, not as a police officer, but as a private citizen who saw the escalating situation for what it was. A potential disaster that needed a steady, local hand before it spiraled completely out of control. The first project was the house. The structure that had stood for generations as a symbol of their isolation was now the first target of public intervention. Lyda, coordinating with Thorne, hired a local contracting crew from Beckley, men who knew the roads and, more importantly, knew how to approach a situation like this with a degree of quiet respect. The crew arrived not with a thunderous roar of machinery, but with a quiet efficiency. They replaced the rotting porch boards where Laureen sat, patched the gaping holes in the tin roof that let in the rain, and reinforced the foundation that was slowly surrendering to the Appalachian soil. For the Whitakers, it was a bewildering intrusion. Ray barked incessantly at the strangers, while Laureen and Timmy retreated into the dark interior of the shack, their familiar world being dismantled and rebuilt around them. Only Betty stood as the intermediary, watching with a cautious, hopeful gaze as the physical decay of their home was finally being reversed. If you've been following this story and the complex ethical questions it raises, write "Justice for the Whitakers" in the comments. It's a way to show support while acknowledging there are no easy answers. The work on the house was a tangible victory, a direct conversion of digital goodwill into physical shelter. But it also brought a more daunting question into sharp focus: what about their health? With the GoFundMe providing a financial cushion, the possibility of professional medical assessment was no longer hypothetical. Lyda consulted with Dr. Armand Dorian, a Los Angeles-based emergency room physician who had seen the video. Speaking purely from observation, Dr. Dorian noted that the family's physical and cognitive conditions were consistent with a range of rare autosomal recessive disorders, exacerbated exponentially by the double first cousin genetic bottleneck. He stressed that while the underlying conditions were irreversible, intervention could drastically improve their quality of life: proper eye care for Laureen and Timmy, dental work for all, and a nutritional plan to address decades of deficiencies. This new front, the medical front, presented the most profound challenge yet. It wasn't about fixing a roof, it was about intervening in their very bodies. The conversation shifted from contractors to doctors, from building materials to medical appointments. The logistical hurdles were immense. The family had no medical records, no history with doctors, and a deep, instinctual fear of outsiders. A trip to a clinic in Beckley was, for them, the equivalent of a trip to another planet. Betty became the crucial gatekeeper for this new phase. In a conversation with Lyda over the phone, her voice was strained. "I can get him to a doctor," she said, her Appalachian drawl heavy with doubt, "but I can't make him understand it. Ray, he ain't gonna let nobody poke and prod him. Laureen, she'll just be scared. You're trying to help, I know. But this is a whole different thing than fixing a porch." The money had opened a door to modern medicine, but forcing the Whitakers to walk through it felt like a new, more intimate form of violation. The delicate ecosystem of aid and trust, built phone call by phone call between California and West Virginia, was shattered not by an internet troll or a trespassing tourist, but by the rumble of an unfamiliar engine. A rusted-out Chevy Nova, coughing blue smoke, rattled into the clearing one afternoon, harking aggressively close to the new porch. A man in his late 40s, wiry and with a face hardened by something other than simple poverty, stepped out. He walked past Ray's confused grunts and approached the porch with a proprietary air. This was Kenneth, Betty's nephew, a man who had left the Hollow years ago for a string of dead-end jobs in Ohio and had never looked back. He'd seen the videos. He'd heard about the money. "Aunt Betty," he said, his voice a low, accusatory drawl, "heard you all struck it rich. Funny nobody thought to call me." His accusation hung in the thick, humid air, a poison dart aimed at the heart of the family's fragile new stability. He wasn't there to help, he was there to collect. During a scheduled phone call with Lyda, Kenneth snatched the phone from Betty's hand. His voice, now slick with a performer's grievance, poured into the receiver. He accused Lyda of being a puppeteer, getting rich off his family's misery, and painted Betty as a simple-minded gatekeeper who was being duped. "This is my family, my blood," he insisted, his words dripping with a manufactured sense of responsibility. "That money belongs to us, and I'm the only one here with sense enough to manage it." The threat was clear. The man who had abandoned the family in their deepest obscurity had returned, summoned by the scent of money, to claim a stake in their public tragedy. Kenneth's arrival was a seismic shock, transforming the project's ethical complexities into a raw, tangible conflict. The battle was no longer against poverty or public curiosity, but against internal greed. He began making noise in the small community around Odd, spreading a narrative that cast Lyda as a California exploiter and Betty as his foolish accomplice. He threatened to talk to lawyers, to news stations, to anyone who would listen to his story of being the disenfranchised heir. This forced Lyda and Deputy Thorne into a defensive posture they never anticipated. They were no longer just managing aid, they were now forced to protect the Whitakers from one of their own. The clean, albeit complicated, mission to provide care was now mired in a bitter family feud, raising a devastating new question: how do you save a family from itself? The local Beckley news station, hungry for a story with a national echo, gave Kenneth the platform he craved. He sat in their small studio, his face a mask of practiced concern, weaving a tale of a sophisticated California filmmaker who had swooped in and hypnotized his simple-minded aunt. The segment, titled "Charity or Captivity," the Whitaker family story, framed Mark Lyda as a manipulative outsider and Kenneth as the prodigal nephew fighting to reclaim his family's dignity. The narrative was simple, powerful, and deeply resonant with a local population long wary of outsiders. Deputy Thorne's phone began to ring. Calls came from concerned citizens, angry neighbors, even the county prosecutor's office, all asking the same question: what was really going on up in that hollow? The tide of public opinion, once a force for good, was turning into a dangerous, unpredictable current. The story, now legitimized by a local news broadcast, was a juicy morsel for the national content aggregators. Tabloid websites and rage-baiting social media pages picked it up, stripping away all nuance and amplifying the conflict. The headlines were brutal. Filmmaker accused of exploiting inbred family for YouTube cash, family member fights for control of GoFundMe fortune. The comment sections on Lyda's own videos transformed overnight. The compassionate dialogue was drowned out by a chorus of outrage directed at him. His supporters were accused of being naive dupes. The GoFundMe page, once a symbol of collective goodwill, became a battleground, its comments section a sewer of accusations. Lyda, from his California studio, watched helplessly as the narrative he had so carefully tried to manage was hijacked and twisted into a weapon against him. The digital vitriol soon manifested in a far more dangerous form. Fueled by Kenneth's rhetoric and the sensationalist news cycle, a small group of local men, self-styled defenders of Appalachian sovereignty, decided to take action. They saw it not as trespassing, but as a rescue mission. One evening, a convoy of 3 aging pickup trucks, engines rumbling with aggressive intent, churned its way up the muddy path to the Whitaker homestead. These were not curious tourists with iPhones. They were men with a grim purpose, their faces set with a righteous anger. They were there to liberate the Whitakers from the coastal exploiter and his local accomplice, Betty. The fragile sanctuary, already violated by fame, was now under siege from a homegrown militia acting on a lie. The standoff was a tinderbox of raw nerves and simmering rage. Kenneth, emboldened by his new allies, led the charge onto the property, shouting for Betty to come out and face him. Ray, sensing the unprecedented level of threat, was in a state of pure primal terror, his barks turning into hoarse, desperate shrieks as he darted back and forth at the edge of the porch. From inside the shack, a terrified whimper could be heard, Lorene, lost in a darkness now filled with terrifying sounds. Just as the men began to advance on the steps, the wail of a siren cut through the trees. Deputy Thorne's cruiser slid to a halt, kicking up mud. He emerged, hand on his sidearm, and placed himself squarely between the intruders and the porch. "This ends now, Kenneth," Thorne commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You've made your point. Now get off this property before you turn a family drama into a felony." The air in the clearing crackled, thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and the metallic tang of impending violence. Thorne stood his ground, a solitary figure of the law against a tide of misplaced righteousness. Kenneth, seeing his moment of power being challenged, stepped forward, his voice dripping with contempt. "You got no right, Thorne. This is family business. These are my people. You're just a uniform, protecting the California moneyman who started all this." One of the men from the trucks spat on the ground. "He's right. We're here to look after our own." The circle tightened, the men shifting their weight, their anger a palpable force field. Thorne didn't flinch. He knew this was more than a legal dispute. It was a battle for the soul of the hollow. Ray's barks had subsided into guttural, exhausted growls, his small body trembling with a mixture of fear and protective instinct. The situation was a single spark away from exploding into something that could never be undone, a tragedy born from a live broadcast on the evening news. Then, the screen door of the shack creaked open again. It wasn't a sound of fear this time, but one of grim finality. Betty Whitaker stepped onto the porch, her face a mask of stone. She ignored the mob and Deputy Thorne, her eyes locking onto Kenneth with an intensity that silenced the clearing. "You ain't family," she said, her voice low but carrying across the yard with absolute authority. "Family don't leave their kin to rot for 20 years. Family don't come back only when they smell money. You ain't here for Laureen or Ray. You're here for what that man's camera brought." She took a step forward, her frail form radiating a power that dwarfed the men's bluster. "These boys," she said, gesturing to the militia, "they might be fools, but they came here 'cause they thought they were doing right. You came here for yourself. You ain't Whitaker, you're just a vulture." Betty's words struck the men with the force of a physical blow. The righteous anger drained from their faces, replaced by a dawning, uncomfortable shame. They looked from Betty's resolute face to Kenneth's sputtering, exposed greed. They hadn't come to be part of a shakedown. One by one, they began to back away, muttering apologies, their crusade dissolving into embarrassment. They climbed into their trucks and retreated down the dirt road, their engines a sound of defeat. Kenneth stood alone, stripped of his power, his face a contorted mess of fury and humiliation. Thorne stepped forward, the handcuffs clicking with a sound of cold finality. "Kenneth, you're under arrest for trespassing and menacing." As Thorne led him away, the clearing fell into a deep, wounded silence. The only sounds were Laureen's soft sobbing from within the dark shack and the heavy, ragged breathing of Ray, who had finally collapsed onto the porch, the loyal guardian of a peace that had been irrevocably broken. The legal fallout from Kenneth's arrest was swift but, in the grand scheme of things, almost anticlimactic. He faced misdemeanor charges for trespassing and menacing, resulting in a fine and a court-ordered restraining order that legally barred him from the property and from contacting Betty or the other siblings. The real consequence was not legal but social. In the tight-knit communities of Raleigh County, where reputation is a currency more valuable than cash, Betty's powerful denunciation had branded him a vulture. The men who had followed him up the hollow faded back into the landscape, their misguided crusade transformed into a source of local shame. Deputy Thorne, now a committed if unofficial guardian of the family, ensured the restraining order was understood by all. The incident, born of digital fame and greed, had paradoxically reinforced the old Appalachian code. You protect your own, and Betty Whitaker had proven, beyond any doubt, who was truly her own. In the end, the story of the Whitakers resolves into a profound and unsettling ambiguity. Mark Laita's lens brought tangible improvements. The roof no longer leaks on Laureen as she sits in her familiar spot. Betty has a reliable truck to get groceries from Beckley, a lifeline that didn't exist before. The GoFundMe provided a financial security that has, without question, eased the physical hardship of their daily existence. Yet, the fundamental tragedy remains untouched. No amount of money can repair their DNA, restore their sight, or bridge the cognitive chasm that separates them from the world that now watches them. The intervention made their cage more comfortable, but it also put it on public display. The question Laita faced in that motel room years ago still hangs in the air, now heavier than ever. Was this documentation, or was it exploitation? The answer, for the millions who have watched their story, remains a deeply personal and uncomfortable one. The final image is one of quiet endurance. On the repaired porch, Laureen hums a tuneless song, her face turned toward the warmth of a sun she cannot see. Ray sits at her feet, no longer a frantic sentry but a calm, watchful presence, his head resting on her knee. The storm of the outside world, with its cameras, its cash, and its cruelty, has passed over them, leaving behind both wreckage and repairs. Their lives continue, dictated not by YouTube comments or GoFundMe balances, but by the same simple, immutable rhythms of day and night, of hunger and care. They remain a family trapped by a secret as old as the hills, a living testament to a tragedy written in blood. The world may have found them, but it will never truly reach them. The Whitaker family's journey is a powerful reminder of the complex human stories hidden in the forgotten corners of our country. If their story has moved you, subscribe to our channel for more investigations that challenge what we think we know. And if you're ready for another deep dive, watch our documentary on the Fugate family, the Blue People of Kentucky. A story of genetic isolation that is just as haunting, and just as human as this one.